Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Duty, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune in to Student Affairs Live along with my brilliant friend and co-host, Heather Shea Gasser, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. If you're unfamiliar with past episodes, I highly recommend you check out and favorite the archive link that we're tweeting out now. We're proud to have covered over 100 important topics with over 200 of the very top practitioners, scholars, and experts in our field. In a moment, I'll introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Coit, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors who make Student Affairs Live possible. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing communication firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Your program pages are some of the most marketing critical on your website, and if your faculty has expertise that can provide a critical content pool to raise the prominence of your institution, you also have content strategy to leverage these important resources. Register now for M. Stoner's two-part webinar series. We're tweeting out a link where you can learn more and sign up. Student Affairs Live is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of the professional association. ACPA publishes the Journal of College Student Development and About Campus, and has recently launched a new content delivery platform, ACPA Video on Demand. Check it out today at videos.myacpa.org. Stay tuned and also mark your calendars for March 8th. At a special time at 12:30 Eastern Time for a very special live event from ACPA in Montreal, as Heather and I host a star-studded cast of Student Affairs giants, including Susan Jones, Gretchen Metzler, Stan Carpenter, Patrick Love, Paul Shank, Chris Wren, Zeb Davenport, Danielle DeSowell, Paul Gordon Brown, Ed Cabellon, Stacy Pearson Wharton, and Keith Edwards, as they face off in head-to-head 8-minute micro debates with a live audience and live Twitter participation. As Nicholas Negroponte from MIT once said, great education has to be great entertainment. I promise it's either going to go horribly great or horribly bad or wonderfully great. So I want to take a moment also and thank Kate Zulo and Carrie Locke, who are in the studio with me today, monitoring the back channel and forwarding me your best content and questions from the Twitterverse. I want to remind everyone these episodes are designed to be interactive, so your engagement throughout the show, your questions and comments on Twitter, really improves the quality of dialogue. So finally, I'm honored to have Dr. Jennifer Coit with us today. You can read her full biography on the episode page. Jennifer, thank you for joining us. Could you please briefly describe your current role and share with us your best or your worst memory about your first-year experience back from your undergraduate days?
Sure. Thank you, Tony, and thank you to Higher Ed Live, M. Stoner, and ACPA for hosting me on the show. It's a great honor. I am the director of the National Resource Center for the First-Year Experience and Students in Transition. It's a long title. We probably need an acronym, but I also, as I often say, I need to buy a vowel in there somewhere. It doesn't quite work. But this is a center that's a national, international center that provides professional development, publications, original research, and resources related to all student transitions into and through higher education. It historically started with first-year experience, but now we've expanded that umbrella to almost any transition point, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. Our mission is to support and advance efforts to improve student learning and transitions into and through higher education, and I'm honored to be able to oversee all the scholarly, strategic, and operational aspects of the center and work with a great staff to make that magic happen. We're located at the University of South Carolina and very proud of that historical and ongoing connection to an institution. And because of that, I'm also pleased to say that I'm an affiliated faculty member in the College of Education in the Education, Leadership, and Policies Department. My best and worst memory, I went to UCLA, so if there are any fellow Bruins out there, you all can do an A clap. I'll spare everybody else. But the best experience was just being there. UCLA was in every way, shape, and form my dream school. It's everything I envisioned I wanted from an undergraduate experience, and I was so fortunate to go to it. That led to a little bit of an imposter complex. I kept on expecting them to come and tap me on the shoulder and say, there's been a horrible mistake, you know, you're not supposed to be here. But for the most part, it was a really, truly wonderful experience. My biggest, I don't know if worst memory, but my biggest disappointment was that that was an era when guaranteed housing was not guaranteed for first-year students. So I never got the experience of living in on-campus housing. So my first year I actually lived in a private boarding house off campus that operated like a small residence hall, but it wasn't the same, and I was heartbroken. To this day, it actually haunts me, because when I've done presentations for housing and res life and residential curriculum institutes, I often will confess, like, I never lived there, I never lived on campus, and it still breaks my heart to this day. So I think that's probably my biggest regret. I'm not sure I have a worst memory. I have plenty of entertaining memories, but that might be best suited for another time. So.
You know, maybe you could do one of those my freshman year studies, right, where you go in and spend a year and make up for that year.
Yes, me and Rebecca Nathan, right?
That's right. So I know that first-year experience student transitions is really a broad topic, and I wonder if from a national perspective we're all talking about the same thing. So can you help us frame it? How would you define it?
Yeah, I'm going to look at some notes here, so if I look down, I'm actually not texting or anything. I've always loved the definition that was provided by Drew Koch and John Gardner in a 2006 piece that they wrote. And they wrote that the first-year experience is not a single program or initiative, but rather an intentional combination of academic and co-curricular efforts within and across post-secondary institutions. And I really love it because I think that definition speaks to the complexity and multiplicity of it, the first-year experience programming, the intentionality being a key component. Truth be told, students are going to have a first-year experience whether we do anything or not. It's just a matter of what the quality of that experience is going to be and how meaningful and impactful it'll be. I love the collaborative nature of this work that's suggested in that, not just within and across units on campus, but really between sectors of education. When you think about the K-12 to higher ed connection that this has, the 2-year to 4-year connection that the transfer student experience has. So there's a lot of connectivity that I think is also suggested there. That's interesting, though, because one of our most recent Fiddler grant winners, our center actually sponsors a research grant every year, and one of our recent Fiddler winners, Forrest Lane, he said that students actually aren't seeing it quite the same, though. They're not seeing freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, or first year, sophomore, junior, and senior. His quote says, "Students don't see progression that way, but see it as entering, persisting, and graduating." So once they get over that first hump, they just kind of see the middle as being this persisting, and then you get to the ultimate experience and graduate. So I think that we're actually seeing some ways that students might be defining it differently than us. The one thing I have to say as a pet peeve is that I want to say what FYE is not. And that is, first-year experiences or student transition programming are not one program. Okay, so often we hear people say, well, I don't have a FYE because we don't have a first-year seminar. And I say, well, I'll bet you have a first-year experience, but you may not have a first-year seminar, and that's not required, even though it's quite common of first-year experience programs. But I think that this notion that a first-year experience is any one-star program, like a seminar or orientation or welcome week or advising, is an area where I see a lot of disconnect about what we're talking about. That is a STAR program, but a first-year experience is a constellation that brings together those STAR programs in a way that is a picture that we can all identify, students, faculty, staff alike. Look up in the sky, see those STAR programs, and they come together in a uniform way. So that's the best analogy I can say about what FYE is and what it's not. So I
like that. I often talk about this, and people do see it as an event, and I try and explain to them that it's really a continuum.
Yes.
It starts very early and goes well into and beyond the first year.
Well, it's also getting complicated about when you said it starts very early. When does it start? Now we have dual enrollment, swirling if you're going through many different institutions. You have transfer functionality, even the way we do outreach and early outreach. When you think about it, there are students from middle school that come on campus in the summertime for sports camps, and we give them a student ID, like so that they can see themselves within that environment someday. So we're really blurring the lines of when FYE starts in really exciting ways, particularly as we reach further and further down the educational pipeline to engage students in a college-going culture. So, yes, we can say temporally it starts when you come to campus, or you start orientation, or you pay your, you remit your funds or whatever. But I think that there's some exciting ways that we're actually blurring the lines of when the first year experience starts, and the way that we transition first year experience into other student transitions in an overarching undergraduate experience. That's kind of a pipeline.
Nice. So you kind of touched on this a little bit. How do you distinguish between a first-year experience and a more broad term of student transitions?
Sure. In some ways, I think that definition I provided from Koch and Gardner could be adapted by just saying, student transition programming is. But the truth of the matter is that even though FYE and first-year experience programming has a longer history, it really falls under the umbrella of students in transition. And we broadened out from just that first transition from high school to college to include the transition from 2-year to 4-year, the unique transition of being kind of a newbie into being a more experienced member of an undergraduate community when you go into the sophomore year. There are some significant transition points, obviously, as you go out of college into the world of work or into graduate school. Graduate school itself, we're seeing that people are seeing the new student experience as a graduate student transitioning back into school or into a new set of expectations. So all those fall under the umbrella of students in transition. But there's some interesting things happening too, where we see, life is about managing transition, right? And there are numerous transitions in the undergraduate experience that are maybe more micro in nature and not so temporally identified. And we see those starting to fall under the umbrella of the work that we're doing here, both from a researcher and best practices perspective. So other transitions like changing majors, studying away or studying abroad. The idea of moving from on-campus to off-campus housing, and what does that mean? Going from kind of the enclave of safe enclave to, off-campus housing. Going through the stages of identity development. The idea of advancing, these different elements of shifts in your interpersonal relationships, either with your family at home, your romantic partners at home, engaging with students and supervisors. So there are a lot of different, maybe sort of more micro transitions that we see falling under the umbrella of the work that we're doing here to maybe map what we know about those big transitions onto these maybe smaller but no less significant transitions.
I really like that I hadn't thought of some of those transitions. It's definitely something for us to think about and focus on. And we'll talk about this later, it really broadens how people can impact a first-year experience, right? Yes. We think that there is a first-year office or someone is accountable for this, but everyone has a part in shaping that experience.
Absolutely.
So the title of today's show, it begins with the word trends. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the trends that you're paying attention to this year?
Some of them are the ongoing perennial trends. I think some of them have a little bit more import this year than others, but there's a lot related to ongoing resource sensitivity. The return on investment, the commodification of higher education, which always makes me terribly nervous because that is so difficult to quantify, right? I mean, quantify in ways that I think are more meaningful. The new quality metrics that for a while we had the federal government being pretty heavy-handed in trying to define what education meant and what we wanted to get out of it and the purposes of it. That was exciting in some ways. That was also scary in some ways to have this pretty hefty federal mandate come down. Now we've had some relief from that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that won't come back into play, and I'm certainly keeping an eye on that. One of the things that I think is a trend that I'm going to look at, and I know this is heresy, but I worry that the completion agenda has made it so that we swung the pendulum so far back that all we're talking about is retention, and that really ends the student success conversation. It begins and ends it. And I think people have heard me say this. I get really worried about that. And it's not to say that retention isn't important, so I don't want anybody who's watching this to leave and say, well, Jennifer Coy, director of the National Resource Center, says that retention isn't important. Of course it's important. But it is the most baseline statistic. I mean, we can keep heartbeats in the seat and butts in the beds, if you're a res life person, but the students deserve so much more, and we can give them so much more. And so when we talk about it from solely a completion and retention perspective, I think we lose the nuance of some of the other great outcomes that we could be paying attention to. Skill development, even employability can get hijacked as being pretty transactional and not really looking at, in terms of employability as the next generation of leaders, the next generation of citizens, competencies around writing, communication, quantitative literacy, information literacy, all these different things that are so important. We tend to focus solely on, are you still alive and still here? And that worries me a lot, even though I know that this is really the currency in so many audiences and use that currency, but I really am keeping a finger on the pulse of how we talk about retention and how it either starts or stops our conversations. New traditional students, I'm passionate about who our students are. We see the declining numbers of high school graduates, you know, and increasing numbers of students affiliating with more and different identity areas, which is really exciting, except it's completely outpacing our ability to categorize students. And so we love to count things in higher education, right? We love to put y'all in bins, and students are now diverse to the degree that they have so many multiple identities that are shifting constantly that it becomes challenging for us to really account for that and accommodate it in our consideration. So that's something to look at. New advocates. You know, we constantly see this broadening of people included in FYE and student transition programming. So librarians, fellow undergraduates, campus activities partners, enrollment management, K-12 folks, community partners. I love that this is one of the most inclusive areas of higher education. It really is. Anybody who cares about first-year students or students in transition is a part of our network at the center and is a part of this overall landscape. Internationalization of the first-year experience movement. Our center is now involved in movements in Europe, Canada, we just opened our first affiliated center in South Africa, which is fascinating in terms of what they're using higher education to as a vehicle to advance economic and social imperatives there around social justice. That's a big thing. Something I'm really fascinated about is in an election year where we don't often see the best models, even in our candidates, of civility and civil discourse and agreeable disagreement. I really feel like we're going to have to start being able to model and discuss what that looks like. That difference doesn't need to be villainized from the perspective of something like political ideas or socio-political perspectives. The extremism around that and the inability to actually have discourse, truly discourse, is something that concerns me, and I think that what we do in higher education this year to engage students in the political process or engage them in conversations about the political process is something that's very salient to me this year. And lastly, I mean, FYE is becoming its own subspecialty of higher education, the same way that student affairs did, 30 years ago. Kennesaw State University just introduced about a year and a half ago the first master's program in FYE, which is thrilling and exciting. You see that this is its own area of study. But the challenge then becomes, how do we maintain our social activist roots, our social justice imperative, while we embrace the leadership that comes from sort of being institutionalized, right? That's a tough balance. And that's something I'm constantly keeping a finger on the pulse of over, the arch of this, the movement growing and maturing. So those are things that I think about.
So the comment you made about retention is, are we focusing so much on retention because that's the easiest metric to collect, right? Some of those other outcomes are harder to get at.
Certainly, and that's something to look at too, and it's an answer to one of your later questions that I kind of prepped and thought about, but we can count people. We can count people who are still there, and we can count the people who are gone. Of course, it's an easy one, along with GPA and along with satisfaction, and these are easy metrics to assess. They're important metrics. I'm not saying throw them away, but we can fool ourselves into thinking that they are the appropriate outcomes for the true measures and true areas of interest and areas of growth we want to foster in our students, when really most of the time there's a pretty large disconnect. So if you think about the reasons and the purposes we put behind various programming, especially at these critical junctures of first year and transfer and other student transitions, they're pretty lofty, right? We want to create the next generation of citizens, of leaders. We want to create campus community. We want to create all these different skills. We want to, then to be able to get knowledge in a certain area as well as the ability to be employable and a lifelong learner. And then we say if we're doing a good job or not by saying if they have a high enough GPA and if they're still there and if they're happy. And there's a disconnect between the really important and meaningful learning outcomes we're identifying for these programs and what we're accounting for. I think also it's not just that it's measured, it tends to be driven by enrollment management and dollar signs and all of that too. So we can't diminish that as well. I mean, it is important. That is an important metric of success from that perspective. So to certain audiences, that's always going to be critical, and that's what we can boil it down to. But I just fear that it may be hindering our ability to have more complicated conversations about more nuanced aspects of the undergraduate experience, particularly because those are the things that come up at these critical junctures, right? Like when you have those moments where you have the fork in the road and you can go one way or the other, which is how I see these transition points, that's when the values and that other heavy stuff is meaningful and really can dictate which way you go. So there's
it's obvious you've done a lot of research in this area, and research is a big part of what you do at the foundation. What is some of the more important, interesting research that's currently taking place, and what areas do you think we need to dive into more?
Right. You're outing me as a complete and utter nerd, which I do myself. I am completely a geek, a wonk, a data nerd, all of that. I am a researcher at heart, and really believe in the power of data to tell a story, to tell the student's story, and to have that story and that narrative inform what we do. So to the degree that you just see me with like my tape between my glasses and just caring about numbers, I do have to say that I really feel like those numbers represent something. I'm a steward of the students' narratives, and I always love and am honored by that opportunity to do that. Any research that's addressing the trends I just discussed, of course, is going to be interesting to me. I think that the perennial research being done by the Higher Education Research Institute and the Center for Post-Secondary Research at UCLA and Indiana University, respectively, collecting data through the SERP and NESE is imperative to the ongoing conversation. To have that store of data is so valuable. So that continues to be exciting to me. The other entities that have done research on specific subpopulations of the undergraduate experience, so you have Excelencia in Education doing work on Chicano, Latino, Hispanic students. You have Penn's Center for Study of Race and Equity in Education is doing work on Black and Latino males, which is really interesting. The Community College Survey of Student Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin, studying that student experience and the students in that, I think is really great. I've been inspired by the Winsley, the Wabash study of liberal arts education, Wabash National Study of Liberal Arts Education, not just because of what they're studying, but also because they have modeled in a way that I don't think we've ever thought about large-scale national mixed methodology studies, that they have the survey data, but they have a large-scale qualitative work, and the two of them are being done in a way that's really complementary, and have been done in a way that's complementary, and I really love what that models in terms of methodologies and bringing together some different perspectives. Of course, I'm biased with the center. I love the work that we're doing to look not just at the student experience, but at the flip side of the coin in terms of what the institution is doing. You know, how are we making choices about the types of interventions that we put into place to support student success? Who's teaching them? How many credits are they? What is the topic area? How are they structured? Those are meaningful decisions that I think advance the conversation significantly beyond sort of saying, do you offer a first-year seminar, yes or no? They're not all treated equal. Do you offer learning community, yes or no? The work that we're doing, the work that AAC&U is doing, allows us to drill down further and look at some of the elements that might be levers for success within those experiences and holding us accountable for, are we doing a high-quality job? It's not a checklist. It's not a grocery list. We can't just sort of say, yeah, I do this, this, and this. We have to dig deeper and look at quality issues. In terms of topics that excite me, that I see coming up and that I see happening and that could use more attention, I think certainly studying international students. We have a huge spike recently in the number of international students that are coming in, particularly going through these critical junctures and student transitions. I've really been excited about college and career readiness studies and other like P20 pipeline issues that are connecting the dots between K-12 and higher ed in meaningful ways. We treat that summer like it's a chasm that we can't bridge. Somehow or another, like we don't talk to each other, we don't talk to high school folks, and they only had the same students 3 months before we get them, and somehow there's this unbelievable disconnect. And I see like these college and career readiness initiatives and P20 initiatives really to be a way to connect the dots there in terms of the research. Like I said, looking at how the connection between FYE and more complex outcomes that are tough to measure, but I applaud anyone who makes an attempt to do so. We can spend another hour talking about self-reports with all the nerds in the house and what that means, but making an effort to look beyond just sort of the easy to measure elements and talking about some of the bigger, more important outcomes, I think that's great. And any work that examines the underlying tenets of high-impact practices and why they work and how to turn other experiences into high-impact practices, that is something that I'm passionate about, that folks here at the center are passionate about. How do we turn every student interaction into something that is a high-impact experience?
So you brought up high-impact experiences. Let's jump into that. Can you define that phrase for folks? Because I've heard people understand and explain it differently.
Yeah, I mean, AAC&U really coined this term, and they even have sort of said they had no idea how much traction it would get. You know, I mean, they believe very much in it, but it has been something that it's our vernacular now, right? And everyone came up to me at one point and said, "Oh, are you worried that they're stealing your thunder? And I said, God, no. I mean, like, they've given me a shorthand. I mean, the name of my center is long enough. They've now given me a shorthand to discuss all the different things that we study. So I appreciate that. So I don't actually get totally out of breath by saying the name of our center and our research agenda. But they basically, according to their definition, are these curricular and co-curricular structures that draw upon high-quality pedagogies and practices in pursuit of sort of large-scale 21st century learning outcomes that go beyond just the retention initiative, that include they say intellectual and practical skills, personal and social responsibility, competency and knowledge areas, integrative learning, all those kinds of bigger things. But they generally are saying that high-impact practices are things that the research has shown work. I mean, they have to be vetted. We can't just kind of anoint anything that way. They tend to be structures rather than programs. A one-off, one-time thing, that's not a high-impact practice. That's a really great one-off event. They need to be intentionally connected to outcomes. That's really critical. They have incredible potential in terms of being able to advance equity because their effects have been shown to be greater for historically underserved students. So they're a tool for equity, which is really exciting. And they gave us that list of 10, the holy list of 10. I practically envisioned some prophet coming down from the mountain with that written on tablets, right? Because we refer to them so much.
Sure.
Learning communities, research, writing intensive courses, first-year seminars, common learning. I could go through all of them. And they're so powerful that many people, including I think George Koo is the one who first said it, they've become a metric of undergraduate success. So he said basically every student to have a quality undergraduate experience should be exposed to two high-impact practices, one in the first year and one at some point thereafter. So these high-impact practices now become almost metrics of quality for first-year experiences and undergraduate experiences. But my thing is that it's not just a checklist. So here's the thing, like you can walk away and say that we're done with that definition of high impact practices. They're the checklist of 10 and I can go through them and say, yep, we do all those. But the truth of the matter is that they will never reach their full potential. And I'm kind of riffing from a George Koo quote here. They'll never reach their full potential unless they're done with quality, they're implemented with quality, and that they're continually assessed. And those are the two things that trip us up. I can offer a first-year seminar, but if I'm not assessing it, and I'm not holding myself accountable to any standards of quality, which tend to change over time, that's not really a high-impact practice. It's just a title of one. Right. And the most exciting piece, I think, that I've seen from that work is the fact that AAC&U and others, I think they partnered with Ken O'Donnell, I know they partnered with Ken O'Donnell from the CSU system, the California State University system, shout out to the West Coast, they actually dug deeper and said, these are the 8 tenets that make these other 10 practices impactful. And they said that it's an investment of time and energy. It creates meaningful interaction with faculty and peers, real-world applications, high expectations, frequent feedback, exposure to diverse perspectives, demands reflection and integrated learning, and accountability. And those 8 things are actually what makes something high impact. That list of 10 is fantastic, and they have research that shows that they incorporate these 8 principles, but I'm more excited about those 8 principles because if we know what makes something impactful, that list of 10 can be a list of 50. It can be a list of 110 because we can infuse those principles into any other high-touch common student experience like student employment, peer leadership, advising, residential life. Why aren't these our touchstones for all of that? And then it doesn't have to be a list of 10. It can be a list of any number. For God's sakes, I once worked with an institution. I tell this story all the time. It was a commuter institution, and they were dedicated to making parking services a high-impact practice. God bless them, man. The parking services is a thing that everybody complains about, right? And they really invested in it and did everything they could to infuse parking services and parking and commuter services with those 8 impactful elements, so that they could say this common experience on a commuter campus, because 80% of our students had to go there to get parking passes or bus passes or whatever. This is a common experience for our students, more so than almost anything else. Let's make that impactful. So to me, that's exciting.
I'm glad that you pointed it out. If I had a criticism or maybe a concern about the high-impact practices, it's that people use these tablets to dismiss all other learning.
Yes.
Right. So you refer to another framework. So are there other ways that we can broaden this definition beyond academics? Because high-impact practices were about academic learning, right? They weren't about more broad, holistic learning that might take place. They're pretty honed, specifically go after academic mission, academic learning.
I think this is a challenge we have to think about from a couple different perspectives, because it's pretty easy for student affairs professionals, and I've lived on both sides of the house and I've built a professional identity where I live in the liminal space between the two. So I think I know them pretty well, both, but it's pretty easy for us to say, well, they're just talking about the classroom. They're talking about the sort of academically or educationally purposeful enterprise of the institution. If we as student affairs folks, we have just as much impact on the sort of educational enterprise, the meaningful educational enterprise of the institution. It may not be in a classroom, but we will tend to put ourselves outside of that. Well, they're just talking about that. There's no reason that we aren't, that we actually are engaged in the academic enterprise of the institution that's very central to that mission. And the way that we can do that is through these tenets, infusing our work with these 8 tenets, right? And then we can make anything impactful. I mean, there's research that says all of these things are highly transferable. All these elements are highly transferable to other pieces of the undergraduate experience. That's the way that I think student affairs can make it more relevant. AAC&U did a great job with this, but they were also working towards a membership that was predominantly on the academic side when they first put this out there, and it got life of its own. I think it's up to us then to take the mantle of leadership in student affairs and expand the definition and include more of these elements as high-impact practices. I know George Koo has been championing student employment. One of the things I've been doing a lot of research on is student leadership, peer education, student paraprofessionals. I look at this list, and every research or practice I've done related to peer leadership or student paraprofessionals includes most, if not all, of these. That is a high-impact practice, and it's infused throughout the institution, historically, actually, in student affairs and student services. You know, orientation leaders, resident mentors, campus activities, leaders in various organizations. So I think we have to place ourselves in the conversation by saying that our work is central to the academic mission and the educational enterprise, but we also then have to take the leadership to expand the definition and use these 8 tenets to include all that other stuff that we're doing. It's tough though, because it requires it requires us to really hold ourselves accountable to a pretty strict set of standards here, right? I mean, if parking services, they have to put together a set of learning outcomes. That's kind of hard to do for parking services when they did that, but they did, and it reframes how we think about especially transactional services. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll share with the audience, you have shared a treasure trove of resource links that we've been tweeting out. Are those 8 tenets a part of that link, or can we find them?
They are part of one of the presentations that I did at AAC&U on first-year seminars. I think it's one of those, but if not, I can certainly make sure that we tweet out that presentation, because I do talk about the transferability of the notion of impactfulness to other domains through these 8 tenets.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to move into a speed round. We're going to change it up a little bit on you. All right, got my timer out here.
Uh-oh, wait, you gotta let me find my notes here.
We typically have a range of professionals watching the show, and I know we do today. We've got faculty, we've got all kinds of student affairs professionals, enrollment and admissions professionals. Mm-hmm. So they may be wondering, how can they contribute to and measure first-year success? So I'm sure you could do a whole show on each of these topics, but for time's sake, we're going to do speed round. I'm going to give you 30 seconds or less.
I talk really fast, so this will be good.
I know you do. And it's great. We're getting like twice the show in an hour.
Yeah, thank God it's recorded, because people can slow it down.
That's right. So I'm going to ask you to give a few concrete ideas or strategies on how these seemingly unrelated departments can make a difference in the first-year experience.
Sure.
All right, you ready? Mm-hmm. First one, individual academic departments. Go.
Quality implementation of high-impact practices, not just a checklist approach. Faculty making them accessible to new students, and I mean faculty, senior faculty, not just handing that to the assistant professor as you teach that large-scale 101 kind of class. Seeing academic work in the disciplines as the focus of the entire undergraduate experience, that entire arc, and not just the domain of upper division students. And engage partnership with student affairs. I mean, this is higher education in general is collaborative work, but FYE and SIT is the most collaborative and partnership-based model there is in our field.
Excellent. All right, next one, institutional assessment and research offices. Go.
Okay, well, I'm going to borrow from some work I've been doing, recent work out of the Association of Institutional Research, because they're doing a great work on how to reframe this. So using data as a way to engage campus constituency is not as a measure of exclusivity. It's not like, this is my data, I'm going to sit on it in the sandbox, it's my toy. There's great unifying power in assessment, in learning outcomes that cross over different divisions, in collaborative assessment activities. Not only is there unifying power, there's resource savings to be had there. And providing accessible data and actionable information to all campus decision makers, and broadening, this is where AIR has been doing good work, broadening the notion of campus decision makers to include not just higher up leaders, but faculty members at all levels, staff members, and even students are key decision makers. Everybody in that whole pool is making decisions at all levels at the institution and could really use actionable and informative data to move those decisions forward.
Oh, right on time. All right. Health and counseling centers.
I cannot say enough how critical these partners are, particularly as more and more students are coming into higher education with diagnosed emotional and mental health care needs under pharmacological intervention. These partners, in terms of diminishing the stigma of this, making the transition into adult management of your own health, emotional health and mental health, an element of the undergraduate transition experience that's critical. We used to teach students how to do the laundry. Now we're teaching them how to renew their own prescriptions for pharmacological intervention, for anxiety or depression, how to find a new provider in terms of a therapist or a psychiatrist or another provider, how to engage with your insurance in a way that's meaningful. Those are all elements of transitioning to adulthood and into college if you're under the care of this. The other thing is training allies and engaging advocates, because we are finding that there's more need than capacity with our health and counseling centers. So how do we engage other folks and equip them meaningfully to address issues of health and wellness among our students?
All right, next one, student conduct offices.
Certainly a developmental approach, which I think most of them are doing. You know, this more than just wrapping students on the knuckles. Obviously, there's a behavioral intervention element to this. There's an element of really helping students look at these missteps as developmental opportunities. I think that these folks are going to be critical, as I talked about earlier, in terms of shaping a campus environment with codes of conduct or civility agreements or tenets of community membership in a way that's going to facilitate the conversations I said earlier that we need to have about civility, political discourse, all of those things. I feel like our student conduct offices right now are going to be critical to helping us create an environment and shape that environment in a way where those things can happen. And maybe someday, you know, our next generation of political leaders will come out of that experience with a little bit, perhaps better equipped to manage that kind of conversation.
Okay, housing and residential life.
These folks have been long-standing partners in transition programming, particularly in the first year, as we're seeing more residential environments require living on, unlike what I had. But you know, this is one of the few times in our lives when our living environment is integrated physically with our learning environment. You know, I know that student affairs professionals sometimes will crash on our couches in our office, but for the most part, our living environment is separate from our learning and working environment. There's incredible potential there to create intellectual, physical, and almost sort of metaphysical spaces to capture that learning and reflection, whether it's classrooms in the residence halls and blending that, whether it's living learning communities, or just sort of informal spaces and structures to facilitate not just learning and dialogue, but also the quiet for reflection. Because sometimes you got to have quiet, which we don't often have, to create the reflection, and that living space is where students are going to find a lot of that quiet and be able to dive into some true reflection.
Great. All right, admissions and enrollment management.
I'm going to include a lot. Admissions and enrollment management has been a leader in terms of the inclusion of transactional services we historically say, well, that's just the business side of the house, into the student success and transition equation. They have been key partners in terms of putting themselves in the pipeline or the overarching work on getting students into the university. So it's not just a transactional exercise. It's setting meaningful expectations of the undergraduate experience, embracing and welcoming them into that environment in a way that we can make good on that promise. That they identify learning outcomes that are consistent with orientation in the first year experience, so the student doesn't feel like they're handed off like a baton in a relay, but instead it's integrated and seamless transition from enrollment management and admissions to orientation to welcome week to the first year. So seeing themselves as a part of that pipeline, but also setting it up in a way that's so it's very seamless and integrated across all of it.
All right, how about librarians?
I love our librarians. The funniest part of that is that we see a greater number of them at our annual conference, and they're really loud. It always makes me giggle because the whole historic one of the shh kind of librarian, they're really loud and fun, and it's great. They are an important partner that is often overlooked in the ability to address so many of the 21st century learning outcomes of information literacy, research skills, writing ability, study skills, inquiry and analysis, all those that are on that list of kind of competencies that we put out there that are these 21st century learning outcomes that go beyond just retention, that we're giving students all this capacity to be lifelong learners and engaged. Our librarians have not just the skill set, but the environment to actually facilitate real, relevant learning on all of those, and forging partnerships with them in the first year experience and beyond, particularly in the transition from from lower division to upper division, where students are starting to build an identity around intellectual discourse, intellectual research. Both of those points, those are key partners to help give the students the capacity to be able to do that in dialogue in the language of information literacy and research and all of that.
All right, last one. Registrar, bursar, financial aid office, and other business services.
Okay, so can I confess that I added this one to the list because this is my campaign? Is that okay?
Yeah.
As I said earlier, enrollment management have been the leaders on this, but I really believe that if we want to truly do great work, we have to stop dismissing these folks as transactional business services. Some of the most common experiences, every student has to pay to be there some way or another. Most are going through some sort of financial aid. They have to enroll in courses. These are common experiences that we should be focusing on as high-impact practices, and yet we hardly ever include our colleagues from these offices in our discussions about student development and transition. They're considered quite separate, right? Like that's something that they do, and then they come to us and we have the bigger conversation. We've got to connect those dots, and the biggest thing I can say to those professionals is, please come out and start that. If you have to be the first one to put your arm out or put your hand out and shake hands and do it, I think that you'll find receptivity. I really do. But it's a difficult divide to break down. And I think that we can learn from how our enrollment management and admissions colleagues did it and start to include more folks from what we consider the business side of the house. And so any receptivity of those folks to being a part of the larger discussion and to making those experiences less transactional and more developmental, I think is really, really important. Even just to be receptive to it. You don't have to have the answer, but just to be receptive to the potential of that.
So I'm going to jump ahead to a question. We got a question from Jason Cottrell, and he asks, do you know Jason?
I do.
Okay. So he said, common reads must include librarians. How do you implement a summer and winter reads into curriculum during the first year experience? And my related question is, how do you navigate the politics surrounding a common read? I mean, every academic department wants it to focus on their area. How do you find something and get everyone to agree that this is what we're going to use moving forward?
Well, there was a lot in there, and I want to make sure I get to Jason's question. So what was his question again, the first one?
How do you implement a summer-winter read program?
I like summer reading. I've done a lot of work on common readings lately, and actually today I want to let you know that the National Association of Scholars came out with the most recent volume of their annual report on this. So they're another entity that does work on this, and we may have different perspectives, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that they just released the report. I think actually it was yesterday. But anyway, common reading are really exciting because it actually is the overlap of two of those high-impact practices, which are first-year experiences and common intellectual experiences. So it really draws from both of those, and they have incredible potential in the sense that they reinforce the core curriculum and the general education up front. They model academic behavior. They communicate expectations. They facilitate involvement. They bring together the idea of they forge an intellectual community with faculty and staff and students. They model things like understanding of diverse opinions, if the book is contentious, civic discourse, introducing principles of academic freedom, and even the responsibility of speech rights. You know what I mean? I can say something that's different from you, but I have a responsibility underneath my right to that free speech. I mean, those are some exciting things we can be showing students and modeling through this. And I think that there's even been research lately that says that based upon what you choose, you can have a potential to destigmatize certain elements in terms of, like, students who have a mental health care issues. There was a nursing article that said the selection of a common reading around mental health and emotional wellness actually can start a destigmatizing process for the campus community. So there's great potential in these things to do amazing work. The outcome and the potential of what we want to achieve with them, I think, is where we need to focus the conversation. We've become very mired in the book. We've become mired in the tool, right? How the tool, if we like or don't like the book, or if it meets my disciplinary perspective or yours. The book is the tool. What we do with it and the outcomes we achieve with that process are really where I think we can find some unifying elements to it. So getting us away from a particular book and getting us to the tactics of discussion and dialogue and what we're going to do with that in some meaningful ways, that's where I think a lot of buy-in can be had, and we can perhaps, not always, sidestep some of these political elements. That's not to say that it won't happen. I mean, the selection of the book and the title, there have been a lot that have been quite contentious, and we saw a great deal of that blow up in the media. I think some exciting ways I've seen this done are using the book beyond just a one-day event and infusing it as a supplemental text in first-year seminars, in English courses, writing and reading, and other gateway courses. Finding a book that may be more difficult to get buy-in from faculty, but that is actually going to be used beyond just that experience. Engaging in other events, multimedia events such as art shows, film festivals, not just having a reader come in, an author come in and speak, but engaging throughout the term in ways where we talk about expression and creation of knowledge from different perspectives. So we can have something from the fine arts in terms of an art show. We can have somebody write poetry about the theme, or write an original short story on it from the English side. We can have people discuss the topic in it. If it's, one of the most common ones that we read recently was on technology and science and kind of that area. That engages a lot of the hard sciences. So there's a lot that can be done as long as we model the interdisciplinarity of it and make it relevant to the different disciplines, both the students and the faculty therein. Now, I think, Jason, I'm probably not giving you the details you want in terms of, like, this is how you do it, this is where you go. That's maybe outside the scope of this, and I can lead you to other details on the outcomes and not the tool, and picking the book in a way that engages the largest number of constituents. We're modeling interdisciplinarity, right? So let's pick a book that has interdisciplinary relevance, and then capitalizing on that interdisciplinary element in programming throughout the first year or throughout the first term, I think, are some ways I see exciting things happening with a common read. I'm really fascinated. We did a study last year on the titles and the rigor and the page count and the topics of common reading programs, and I think you are tweeting a presentation I did on that. Yep. We're going to collect those same data this coming year, and I'm really fascinated to see how common reading programs might actually be related to civic engagement, elections, politics, and all that. If that program is going to pick up and model the kinds of things we want to happen in an election year and taking advantage of this incredible opportunity. I hope it does. So it would be interesting to see if that's being used in a timely and relevant way to deal with sort of social issues and making that relevant for the students. So I'm looking forward to doing that study.
So you co-wrote a book with Gerald Greenfield and John Gardner called Developing and Sustaining Successful First-Year Programs, a Guide for Practitioners. As soon as I found out that you were going to do the show, I went out, bought it, and read it. Excellent book. Highly recommend for anyone in the area.
Thank you.
So the book suggests the creation of a task force or steering committee in regards to the first-year experience. So here at Rutgers, I'm fortunate to be part of such a task force that was formed this past fall. Can you tell us what good practice looks like in this area? Like, why should we form them? How often should they meet? How long? What are some of the positive outcomes that you've seen from these?
Right. I'd be happy to. This goes back to one of the things I hinted at before, which is this idea that FYE and SIT, so first-year experience in SIT programming, students in transition programming, is a really what I called horizontal structure. So if you've ever read Richard Keeling, he talks about horizontal and vertical structures in higher education. We're from a history of vertical structures, which are the silos, right? I remember when I was a graduate student at UCLA, and my whole life was in the College of Education and the coffee shop next door. Truth be told, something horrible could have happened. The College of Engineering, well, actually probably the College of Humanities, because that was further away, could have blown up, and I may not have known about it immediately because my whole world was right there. That's pretty traditional in terms of how we run higher education. It's not the way higher education is headed. Collaboration, partnership, resource sharing is really where we're headed for a number of different reasons. First year experience in SIT programming, we are horizontal by nature. We touch a lot of different pieces of the university. We just talked about librarians, transactional services, academic departments, orientation, admissions and enrollment management, advising. We're everywhere. All those folks are involved in the first year experience in student transition programming. There is not another entity on campus that has quite that reach. We must model this horizontal organization, and we must lead on how we do this, because other parts of the institution don't know how, and this is really where we're headed. So there's a great deal of power and leadership potential from the first year experience to show higher education writ large how we do this. It's not to say that people don't want to collaborate or partner, but nobody's had to like we've had to. We're bridge builders, we're translators, we tend to get a lot of different people involved. And I think I said I did a blog for the ACPA Commission on Admissions Orientation in the first year experience on this topic, and they're great partners and have been for a long time with the center. So shout out to AO FYE. So one of the elements about having this kind of a task force that's critical is that you continue to model that horizontal leadership and engage people from different parts. It's all participatory governance based. If we want to say, it's easy to say, well, I care about that work, but that's the domain of the first year experience director or the coordinator of new student services or the orientation director. This keeps it really in lived practice, collectively owned, and it provides collective agency, not just ownership, but agency. We're moving something forward. So I think that's really a powerful potential of it. Modeling the horizontal leadership, collective agency, and engaging those different folks in meaningful ways. I think there's incredible resource allocation and sharing and sensitivity that can be gained when you have a bunch of people in a room and are not duplicating efforts, but instead collaborating on different things. There's assessment practices that can be gained in terms of collaborative assessment work, not reinventing the wheel. So these are some of the things that we must do. And truthfully, if you look at the tenets of excellent first year experience in students in transition programming, words like inclusivity, comprehensive, involvement of a wide range of constituent groups, those are words directly taken from those definitions. So we can't even be excellent first year experience programs unless we do that very work, and this is an efficient way to do it. When should they meet and how long? That's tough because these are important, busy people. They should meet regularly enough for continuity's sake, but not meet for no purpose. And what that means is that you really have to be moving the work forward regularly. You can't just meet because we're supposed to and talk about all the wonderful things we've done. We have to continually strive. There has to be a degree of positive restlessness. We're good, but how can we be better? One of the things I will say is that the composition of these different, of the group needs to ebb and flow. So when you're starting a new program, you want your task force to be all of your champions and advocates, very visible people. It's really all about gathering momentum, getting believers on board. When you start to institutionalize, you want the folks who are good at programming and resource management and documenting effectiveness, right? You want it to go that direction so you're able to maintain and sustain the work. It never should be all one or all the other, but it is going to ebb and flow in terms of the roles people have, and you have to accommodate that, because what people too often do is you get your champions and you get your very vocal folks and you keep them on for the duration, and then the project becomes that champion's pet project, and then that champion leaves and the project dies and there's no sustainability. It will ebb and flow back and forth between those in meaningful ways, but there has to be a group of folks who are going to generate momentum, and then there's got to be a group of folks who are going to sort of prove its effectiveness and sustainability, and those both need to be important contingents of the task force, and keep that. The other thing is, I'm a firm believer in finding people who are opponents to your work, who are reasonable opponents. Let me tell you right now, you are not going to get everybody on the bus. Decide the people you will never convince, make peace with it, wish them well, let that go. But find the folks who are critics, but maybe critics in a way that provide you with some really meaningful feedback, and engage them in the process. You will be better for it. So don't make your task force a bunch of believers either. You have to also include some critical discourse and critical feedback, and you can eventually turn that person who's an opponent into a believer. But even if you don't, I guarantee, again, the reasonable opponents, they're going to provide you some meaningful critical feedback to make your work better.
That's great advice for any committee or task force, not just related to first year experience, for sure. So in the remaining 5 minutes or so that we have, I want to ask about move beyond first year for a moment and talk about traditional class year transitions. So reading through some of your past work, you clearly see a deficit in sophomore initiatives. The sophomore year, and I quote from one of your presentations, has been characterized as a sophomore slump, forgotten, invisible, disillusioned, dispiriting, and full of inertia and confusion. So what is occurring developmentally with our students, and what is the institution doing that's contributing to this deficit?
Well, the second year is a really interesting transition for students as they go from being the newbie. Well, for a while it was the newbie that had all the support, you know, and then then you moved into the situation, and we kind of took back that support and said, okay, you're good, you're on your own now. This was before we really got good at seeing transition and managing it from an overarching perspective, and not just kind of all front-loaded in the first year and then paying attention to students at the end, but instead infusing it throughout the undergraduate experience and managing all transitions. We've gotten better as a whole, we meaning higher education. But it's an interesting transition point, you know, so the students it's a critical juncture for them developmentally in terms of their academic development. They're starting to either change majors or find their passion. There's some career development. How am I going to connect what I'm learning to something longer range? Students are beginning to have opportunities to be leaders in the second year. They're, you know, going through elections on campus organizations. They're actually becoming peer advisors, peer instructors, resident mentors, orientation leaders. They're starting to actually not just move into more experience, but the more experienced role, but move into a role of leadership on campus. There are some personal identity issues. There's a beautiful bar chart in a JCSD article, and I wish I could remember the article off the top of my head. I can try to send it to you, but I think it's actually in the presentation that you're tweeting, that takes a look at the distribution of students across the 6 or 7 areas of self-authorship. You know, you go from a completely external to completely internal. And it charts this distribution of students across that in the first year and the second year. And the first year is all heavily, obviously, externally motivated. You don't have a lot of self-authorship. Your identity, your epistemology is all determined externally. But you see in the second year there's a significant shift. Now, they're not completely internally authored either, but there is a shift happening there, developmentally, just from chronological age, but also from the experience of going to college and going through that first year. So there's something developmentally meaty about that moment, and we can capitalize on that. And there's increased capacity to make progress on these outcomes. That's on the student side. But then there's this paradox of expectations, right? So they're still pretty new. They're being charged with taking a broad array of general education courses generally still, but then they're being required to settle on a specific educational track or major. So we're like, what are you going to major in? What are you going to do? But they're still, you know, kind of slogging through all the GE requirements. So the courses in the lower division are taught by generally by teaching assistants, and so sophomores don't really have a lot of opportunity to interact with full-time faculty, which is why before I said, you know, getting faculty involved throughout the undergraduate experience, also in the lower first year end as well. So we're sort of saying, like, what do you want to do with the rest of your life, but you're still slogging very much through kind of that early phase of things. So it can contribute to lack of motivation, a bit of students feeling adrift, disinterest in academics, you know, a desire to find an academic home, but a lack of resources to determine what that is. So there's a lot going on in that year, and I'm really pleased to see more intentionality around sophomore year programming to support those students. So not just programming that sophomores can take advantage of, but programming targeted to second year students in particular. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's some unique elements going on there.
I think we could dedicate yet another show just on that experience. So we're at the end of the show. I want to give you an opportunity to share some resources. I know you have a convention coming up in 2 weeks, and I appreciate you coming out in such a, I'm sure, frenetic time for you. So you have some pitches, you have some resources that you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. Well, the center, obviously, we have our biggest event. It's the annual conference on the first year experience. It's going to be in Orlando, Florida from February 20th through 23rd. We encourage you to come. We have over 1,800 registrants already, so this is a rich and big network of folks. There's lots to learn, lots of networking. It's a very friendly and collegial group, and again, the wonderful thing is you'll probably be exposed to people on a campus you've never been exposed to before, in the sense of that real horizontal experience, engaging with a lot of different folks from a lot of different places. We have our Students in Transition Conference, which is going to be in October of this year, and I encourage you to think about that. That looks at all the different transition points, and the call for proposals will be coming out for that probably in about April. We have several new publications dedicated to critical thinking, dedicated to first-year seminars and learning communities as high-impact practices. We have other ones dedicated to first-generation college students. That's probably one of our best sellers recently. One dedicated to the idea of thriving in transition based upon positive psychology research. So those are some of the resources we have. And then, of course, we have our original research if you want to geek out like me on our website. So www.sc.edu/FYE.
Well, Jennifer, thank you for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. I've learned so much. I'm sure. I generally don't look down to see how many people are viewing. There were a lot of people interested in this topic,
oh, good.
or interested in what you had to say. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I love what I do, and I love what the center's work is, so I appreciate any opportunity to talk to folks about it. Thank you so much for providing this vehicle to do so.
Sure. And I also want to give a shout out again to our sponsors, Stoner and ACPA. Heather and I will be back in 2 weeks with an ACPA convention preview with Executive Director Cindy Love, Convention Chair Chris Moody, and several other key members of the 2016 convention team. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to higheredlive.com's newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. My name is Tony Duty. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.